give the best glide ratio with the flaps retracted, and it is super important to start looking for a possible landing spot as early as possible in case none of the engines would end up relighting. But when doing these exercises, it also became obvious pretty quickly that unless the auxiliary power unit, the APU, was started almost immediately, flying became very hard, since all that the pilots were then left with was manual reversion, as well as all of the other problems that I explained before. Some crews figured this out quite quickly and started the APU without waiting for that step in a non-normal checklist, similar to what Sully did in the Miracle of the Hudson. But the crews who didn't do that would be in for a very complicated exercise. First of all, a lot of altitude is required to accomplish a 180-degree turn without engines. On average, the crews would lose around 1,800 feet doing that. This is why I was saying earlier that the crew in this accident must have been able to climb at least a bit. Because what we saw in the simulator was that if the pilots didn't start turning back almost immediately, or if the bird strike happened at too low altitude, well then getting back to the runway wasn't even an option. And here comes another very interesting observation that we made. Because of what I just explained, most pilots would prefer to turn back almost immediately, even if that meant ending up very high for the landing. They assumed, quite correctly, that if they just put the gear down together with the flaps and then landed with a slightly higher speed, well then the brakes would still be able to stop them. And coming in slightly hot and high would therefore be much better than not reaching the runway at all. But that strategy only worked if the APU was selected on and used for electrical and therefore also hydraulic power. Without that, if they even managed to turn the aircraft around with manual reversion, neither the gear nor the flaps or spoilers would work. And that fact would only then be noticed quite late in the sequence. Now, the manual gear extension would still work, but remembering that among the general chaos that ensued is not as easy as it sounds. So this would generally mean that the ones who didn't manage to get the APU generator engaged ended up high on the approach with a high speed, and then obviously couldn't get the gear or flaps down to help reduce it, nor the spoilers after landing. And if the gear is not down, the brakes are obviously of no use either. So in that scenario, since the spoilers then stayed flush with the wings after touchdown, together with the high speed, it meant that the wings continued producing lift, keeping the weight of the aircraft away from the ground, and that in turn caused the aircraft to basically just skim along the ground on the engine nacelles. Now that would decelerate the aircraft slightly, but not nearly as much as it would with the gear and brakes available, nor with the spoilers engaged. And together, these factors would combine to cause a very long landing distance. Again, these are just observations I've made in the simulator after having administered surprise dual engine failures for years, and it might have no bearing at all on this particular case. But I thought that it would be interesting to share these observations anyway, just to give you a sense of the complexity here. In any case, most crews really appreciated this type of training since it highlighted just how important priorities, areas of responsibility and decisive action really is, as well as the importance of starting the APU if it is available. So, then what else can we see from the videos that have been posted online? Can we learn anything from them, and what might the investigators be looking at? Well, one thing that stood out to me was the almost complete lack of external lights on all of the videos that are available, except for one very noticeable exception that I will soon get to. You see, under normal circumstances, a Boeing 737 on approach will have all the forward-facing lights illuminated. That includes landing lights, runway turn-off lights, taxi lights, the red and green lav lights together with the flashing white strobe lights on the wingtips, and the mandatory anti-collision lights on the lower and upper part of the body. None of those lights were visible on any of the videos that I have seen, and although that can have a few different explanations, the most obvious one is a lack of normal AC power, which in turn could mean that none of the 3 available generators were working. The only light that was actually illuminated on these videos is barely visible, and we had to look at the videos frame by frame to spot it just behind the forward right main door. That little light forms part of the emergency exit lighting, which is put there to illuminate the slides in case of an evacuation. Now those lights are normally extinguished and can be manually illuminated by a switch in the cockpit, but they also illuminate automatically in case of a loss of AC power. So the combination of no normal lights and the emergency exit lights being illuminated again could potentially point towards a lack of AC power, the reason behind which is still to be determined. But the fact that there were no flaps, no spoilers, and that the landing gear never came down also kind of points in the same direction. All of these systems are connected in one way or another, as I just explained. Now, one thing that is a bit harder to explain is that in one of the videos it looks like the reverser on the right side was activated. In case there was no hydraulic power, that reverser should not have been opened. But on the other hand, the fact that the aircraft was skidding on that part of the engine could also just have forced it open, especially if the reverser levers in the cockpit were activated by the pilots in a reflex response. Now in that video I couldn't see the normal reverser plume around the engine, and that could indicate that there was no reverse thrust being generated. This is one of those things that the investigators will be looking closely at, and we will have to wait and see what they finally come up with. Another thing that I'm really looking forward to hear from the final report is